Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to talk about the activation of biases, the stereotypes, and so on. We've been talking about this on the previous video, so I wanted to continue this topic because I think it is really important for us to know what is it about, how we create these biases and these stereotypes in our heads, and also how do we challenge them, how do we overcome those thoughts that were like initial thoughts but then they became this type of ideas that started like making roots in our head and then couldn't go out. With that being said, let's continue. And controlling the initial action of bias association. Although it was previously thought that the automatic elevation of stereotypical mental associations on encountering a relevant group member was both widespread and inevitable, recent research suggests otherwise. The extent to which biased mental associations become activated for perceivers depends on a number of factors, multiple factors, including chronic individual differences such as the perceivers, explicit attitudes, and motivation to respond in non-biased ways, features on the social context and individuals' situational goals, and information processing capacity. Given that individuals like you and I cannot readily change their chronic attitudes and motivations, shift their goals and motivational states, increase their processing capacity, and control the contexts in which they encounter members of stigmatized groups, scholars have looked to more acute strategies to regulate the expression of bias. So we cannot just link having biases and stereotypes to a single cause. It means that we're humans. We have like a variety of reasons in order for us to have these arranged ideas in our heads. So what the scholars are saying is that, hey, we cannot guarantee there's like a single cause even beside one single stereotype or bias thought. So it is likely said that we cannot determine the cause of it, but what we can do is to regulate or try to regulate this kind of bias expressions and stereotypes in order to give you guys strategies to overcome them. We also spoke about the stereotype suppression, but there is like a rebound effect for this strategy. So a bias control strategy having seemingly more general efficacy or effectiveness is actually perspective taken. So it is the active attempt to imagine the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of another individual. We have like a saying that is like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Well, it is like it. In one demonstration, we have like different experiments and of course sample of people that demonstrate that when you have some kind of sympathy or empathy for others, you are more likely to have these thoughts. Is the majority of the cases those are going to arrive yes or yes, but you can be like conscious about them and you can rethink what you were supposed to say, mean, or believe. But what happens? Furthermore, because perspective taken does not entail the active suppression of unwanted ideas or associations, it is not vulnerable to rebound effects. So we go into the same issue, to the same problem. We are humans. We can practice all of this, but sometimes we can forget. Sometimes we can get confused applying this strategy, or sometimes we just be ourselves and I just didn't do it for another reason. Indeed, comparing the effects of stereotype suppressions and perspective taken, Galinsky and Moskowitz in 2000 discovered that whereas stereotype suppressors exhibited heightened stereotype accessibility, actually participants instructed to adopt the perspective of an out-group member did not. So we still have, even in this monitored group of people, when you guys do some kind of test in a group, that's why we do tests, right? That's why we have samples. You cannot guarantee that never that something is going to be 100% something. That's why we test, that's why we try, that's why we investigate, and that's why we have sample groups. And for them, it happened that one person was like not in the average spectrum, let's say that way. And this was what happened. So it happens to all of us. Even though perspective taking may be a more successful strategy for undermining the activation of biased mental associations compared with suppression, although its implementation during intergroup interactions may be less straightforward than suppression. So this could happen in a monitored sample of individuals. And other than that, what about controlling the application of bias association? That will be like another segment of this video. Although the automatic activation of bias associations on encountering a relevant group member is not inevitable, for many it is quite a regular occurrence. What then can individuals do to avoid having their decisions and behaviors tainted by these prejudiced associations? The dominant assumption is that individuals must engage in self-control to stop prejudice from acting, or in their responses to come forward, and those ideas, bias ideas and stereotypes to go to the surface. So the dominant assumption is that individuals must engage in self-control, right? But responses can be stigmatized, especially in group members. So we're going to talk about Monteith and Mark, but mostly about Monteith. So he, in 1993, he spoke about self-regulation of prejudice. So he maintained this type of theory, this type of social norm or model. So it is mostly known as a model that proposes a process through which individuals first learn to control the expression of biased mental associations and over time become less biased. How does this happen? I don't know, but he's going to tell you that the SRP model assumes that for most individuals, encounters with members of low-status social cultural groups result in the automatic, perhaps unconscious activation of biased thoughts and feelings that in turn typically results in, I don't want to say the word, but when we start doing this with people, right? So you go here, group A, B, C. Group A doesn't want to go to B, group C doesn't want to go with A, and so on. Imagine, for instance, a woman who is low in, although control of prejudice is quite promising in that it doesn't require individuals to do strongly held, perhaps unconscious associations. It is not without its pitfalls. First, undetecting the potential for unwanted bias, people may not be able to negate its influence. People may either overcorrect for their perceived bias, perhaps behaving in patronizing ways with members of stigmatized groups, or their efforts at correction may be insufficient or incomplete, insufficient, behaving in ways that subtly reveal their bias. Thus, unless individuals are skillful enough to first identify precisely the magnitude of their bias and to correct for it effectively, becoming more aware of the potential for bias responding may not successfully eliminate it. So here we're getting trained in order to not follow through the idea of the bias thought that we're having, but not actually targeting, pointing out the cause, and trying to eliminate it. So far we're seeing like these strategies are trying for us not to disclose these thoughts at the moment, but what about a strategy that actually help us to overcome the bias thought itself, going to the root and just eliminate it? But so far I haven't seen that on any of the strategies mentioned here in this video or the previous one. So what do you think? Do you think that these strategies have been useful so far, or do you think that we should get digging more case studies, more social groups that we're investigating in order to determine that? And for you, what will be a strategy that could help you eliminate the bias entirely? But I also want to continue. Also, something to take into account is the fact that resources for executive control are limited. Specifically, research suggests that executive functioning draws on a limited source or resource, and thus individual can focus only on a limited number of tasks at one time. Furthermore, we have that self-control strength model suggests that tasks that require executive control temporarily have like a common central executive resource, leaving individuals less able to perform optimally on subsequent executive control tasks. Taking this together, this work suggests that the efficacy of efforts to control the expression of biased mental associations is bounded by the inherent limits of the cognitive research. So what we have here is like another explanation of why we cannot go to the root. Because when we make some type of decision at the moment and also in the social sphere, we just tend to add quickly. Sometimes I said to myself, why there isn't like a book of life that could train us for everything that we face nowadays, and also taking into account the period of time, the age and everything, the profession, and all this type of details that we encounter on each one of our lives. But we don't have that. So we need to add fast sometimes, and we are mostly trained for a bunch of numerous situations that we encounter each day or regularly. With that being said, we don't have that book, and we just decide at the moment, which is great. But also these type of things happen. Like I add, if I remember the strategy, I apply it, but then I go home and then restart. I forgot to look into my brain to say like, why did I think that? Probably this is like a grown type of thinking or processing thing. So why do I look up that? No. We just go again and just forget because we just activate some kind of automated response. Luckily, I remember the strategy I learned the other day. But let's say we go back again to the routine, to something else I was doing. So I'm not paying attention to that thing I did yesterday anymore. And that happens to us often in different areas and different ways and mechanisms that we use every day. To conclude this chapter, although stereotype suppression can be effective in reducing stereotype activation, at least for some individuals, recent research suggests that perspective taking may be a more reliable route to undermine the activation of biased mental associations. after such associations are activated. However, research reveals the important role of self-regulatory processes in undermining their ability to taint individuals' judgments and behavior. With that being said, has been like the most accurate one to use in the like at the moment, that is strategy. But for you, do you think this type of strategies just lack something in general? Maybe not. Would you add another strategy? Perhaps you know another strategy that I don't know. And that will be great. So please share it in the comments, feel free. And also, have you read something specifically about biases and stereotypes? Because I would love to keep digging on this topic. And here I show you some kind of information, a previous video as well. But I also tend to like reading more and more and more. So also tell me which other topics do you like. I'm always open to book recommendations, newsletter recommendations, also articles, magazines, whatever you call it. Not everything needs to be specifically or just on one side or the other. People tend to say like, if you don't read a book, you weren't reading. Yeah, this is a book, but so what? You can also read newsletters on social media. You can also read magazines, because journalism is still pretty great. There are like some journalists out there that are worth reading. So and so on. So if you have any recommendations, please let me know. For you, what was bias before this video? What was the concept of bias for you? And did you know about all these strategies to overcome bias thoughts and stereotypes? Please let me know. See you another time. Bye.